Hi, I just wanted to say hello face to face because I know online classes can feel a little disconnected or kind of clinical. They miss that human element that I think a lot of us really enjoy. So, hello, I'm your instructor for this class. My name is Jocelyn and my crazy last name is Pelagia. So Jocelyn Pelagia, I'm fine with you calling me Jocelyn, no problem. So I wanted to say hello and kind of give you a quick overview about kind of some of the basics in terms of this class, not how the class is run, etc. You can find that out from the syllabus. You can look at the semester calendar, both of which are on the content page within the class. But if you have the textbook and you've looked at it, you might have noticed there's a big section at the beginning that talks about post-colonial literature. And I think that's kind of intimidating to try and understand what that means and sort of like what is modern world literature as a sub-genre within the English discipline. Basically, I'm pretty sure we all know that the history of the world is one of conquest, where colonizers would come in and often take over a country. We saw it here in the United States. We were the colonies. There was already an indigenous population here, the Native Americans, and the history there, I'm assuming we all have some experience with in terms of understanding what happens when colonizers come in, what happens to those existing populations and their cultural habits, their values, their language, their ways of life. So all of the stories and poems and memoirs that we will be reading this semester are based out of that idea that all around the world, many countries have been colonized in history. And when they are overtaken, what happens to the people, the indigenous people who are already living there? So in our textbook, you're going to see and be reading a lot of stories written by people who were colonized or post the time when they were colonized, as in back in the 1400s, Spain and Portugal actually wrote a treaty where they divided the earth and said to each other, you can take that half, I'll take that half. And I mean, I think in reality it didn't play out that cleanly, of course, but if you look at South America and you think about, okay, most of the countries in South America and Central America are Spanish speaking, however, then you've got Brazil where it's Portuguese. Well, clearly that means that explorers from Portugal came and did some colonizing. When that reign was over, then we have the people of Brazil left behind. And the stories that they tell, the things that they would write, would be post-colonial literature. We have examples too of, the current problems in the Middle East you could trace back to when the countries of the Middle East were colonized. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire that was based out of Turkey fell. And that Ottoman Empire had been sprawling all over, into Syria, into Lebanon, had been all over. So the Ottoman Empire fell after World War I. They died on me, and I decided I can't re-babble everything I just babbled. I was talking about how current problems in the Middle East can be traced back however far you want to go. But after World War I, when a lot of the Middle Eastern countries were divided up amongst the British, the French, in some places the Germans, lots of European powers took over and became, they went and colonized a lot of today's Middle Eastern countries. They drew boundaries that defined these countries in ways they never had been defined before. And so then when the period of colonization was over and we see these European powers withdrawing, what we have left behind are countries whose traditional power structures, their kings or their rajas or whoever used to be sort of in charge historically, no longer existed, if there had been a coup or deaths or whatever. So then we have these countries struggling to figure out a new self-identity. And we also have countries that have learned that the way you do define yourself and get along in the world is through the sheer use of force. So there are lasting lessons that come out of colonization. And so we will see when we're reading our poems and stories the effects of colonizing and the effects when the colonists remove themselves. After World War II, that's when we saw a lot of new treaties and new lines drawn around the world. And so we can even say in the last 60, 70, 80 years, we've seen a lot of ramifications of having had certain cultures move in on an existing culture and lay down ways of doing things, and then they remove themselves, and what we have left behind is sometimes chaos and confusion. And so through literature we have a way of understanding that. So I pretty quickly here, I promise I won't babble too much longer, although I could fill hours if you need me to. I wanted to go through some of the main ideas that are covered in just the basic concept of post-colonial literature. And I'm going to use an old school kind of PowerPoint called holding paper up in front of me so that you can see a few of the ideas. So one of the main ideas that will be threaded throughout everything we're reading, or the whole idea of colonization around the world and post-colonial anything, is this idea that in our brains, I think worldwide in fact, most of us have a distinction that could be called binary opposition. And we have a distinction in our brains between, you could say East or West, we could also just say the West, and traditionally the word Oriental cultures have been used. So there is been a line drawn between the idea of being Western and being Oriental. And we clearly all believe that on some level we are different from each other. And so you'll see this playing out in a lot of the things that we read, this idea of tension and push and pull between the different Westerners and the different Oriental or Easterners. Another idea, slide number 2 in the PowerPoint here, another idea that's going to come up a lot in what we're reading are that the colonizers, when they do move into a region or a country, generally have a self-perceived idea that they are destined to rule. In particular, I would say the example of the British moving into India would illustrate this. For several hundred years, the British dominated the ruling of India, and mostly because they knew there were a lot of goods they could get out of India in terms of foodstuffs, but also cheap labor to make material and cloth. And so there was a lot of trade that they could get out of, being the dominant ruling power in India. And there was an attitude among the British, the colonizers, that they were somehow superior, and that the indigenous people, the natives of India, were somehow inferior and born to be servants. So it wasn't until the British removed themselves after World War II that India started to have to redefine itself as a modern entity. So we have to keep in mind the attitudes of the colonizers and how that affects those who are then left behind. We also can see that post-colonialism, just as an academic topic, it generally examines areas of hybridity where two different things have come together, or many different things have come together and created something new, or transculturation, where something from one culture has actually crossed into another culture. And some of the main themes that we will see in what we're reading this semester are the idea of identity and, of course, the politics surrounding identity. And specifically, these would deal with things like gender, race, racism, ethnicity. And we also will see themes that deal with the relations between the powerful and the powerless. So what's that dynamic like? We also will see one of my favorites, just for daily life, creative resistance. How do you do that? You might want to talk to Gandhi about that if you're not sure, except he's too dead, so you can't talk to him. But he had some good ideas. We also will be looking at poems and short stories and memoirs that look at power structures and what happens when social hierarchies are thrown into question. So when everything that's always worked in a place suddenly goes away, then what happens? What happens? You can read the stories. And then lastly, we will be reading stories written by authors. Many of them are fiction, but poems and memoirs are often based directly out of the author's real-life experience. But we're going to be reading voices that are coming out of countries and regions that owe their existence to force. So there are some brutal stories or moments in our textbook, but they are reflecting a kind of reality that it behooves us as citizens of the world to be aware of. And then lastly, what I think is particularly interesting is when you're reading this semester from our textbook, please keep in mind that you are reading the stories of indigenous people who are telling their own stories, where there's a version of events, there's a life narrative, there's a snippet of someone's life, and it's being told in the language of the colonizer. So it's not necessarily that we have stories being told in the native language of someone. In fact, what happens when you've had to adapt your life to your colonizer's language, and yet your experience is very unique to the culture and where you grew up. So if you do not yet have the textbook, please get it. This is what it looks like. You are going to need it because we have a lot of things we'll be reading. There's a breakdown in the semester calendar, which is on the content page of the class. And you will have readings that need to be done by the second week of class. We will have weekly reading check quizzes. We will have discussions. You will be doing a culture presentation. You will be writing a paper. It'll all be really fun, I promise. And throughout all that, just keep in your mind the idea that you're actually doing more than just reading some story that some guy wrote. You're actually getting a chance to kind of think about the history of the world as it's reflected through these pieces that have been written in pretty recent decades. But so they may seem it's modern world lit on the surface, but in fact you're getting insights into long-term consequences and effects of politics throughout history. So that's one of the beautiful things that literature can do, and I'm excited that you're going to be in this class because we get to read some very cool stuff, and I am looking forward to your reflections and observations and insights. So let's have a really good semester.